2. The first volume. The first chapter of Marx's book summed up once again what he had already written in 1859 in his critique of political economy concerning the nature of commodities and money. This was done not merely for the sake of completeness, but because even intelligent readers had often failed to grasp his ideas thoroughly, so that he assumed that there must have been something wrong with his presentation of them and in particular with his analysis of the nature of a commodity. The professorial luminaries of Germany could certainly not be counted amongst his intelligent readers, and they execrated the first chapter in particular on account of its involved mysticism. At first glance a commodity seems a trivial, easily understood thing. However, its analysis shows that it is a very eccentric thing, full of metaphysical subtleties and theological tricks. As far as it is a use value, there is nothing mysterious about it. The form of wood is changed when we make a table out of it. Nevertheless, the table remains wood, an ordinary perceptible thing. But as soon as it appears as a commodity, it becomes transcendental as well as perceptible. It not only stands with its 4 feet firmly on the ground, but towards other commodities it stands upside down, and its wooden head develops whimsicalities far stranger than if it began to dance without human agency. This argument was taken amiss by all those blockheads who could produce metaphysical subtleties and theological quibbles ad lib, but not anything as material and ordinary as a simple wooden table. Considered purely from the literary point of view, the first chapter of Capital is one of the finest things Marx ever wrote. After dealing with commodities, he then proceeded to show how money is transformed into capital. If equal values exchange against equal values in commodity circulation, how can the moneyed man buy commodities at their value and sell them at their value and nevertheless receive greater value than he gave? He can do this because under prevailing social relations he finds a commodity of such a peculiar nature on the commodity market that its consumption is a source of new value. That commodity is labor power. It exists in the shape of the living worker, who needs a certain quantity of foodstuffs for the maintenance of his life and that of his family, the latter guaranteeing the perpetuation of living labor power after his death. The labor time necessary to produce this quantity of foodstuffs, etc., represents the value of labor power. However, this value, which is paid in the form of wages, is much less than the value which the purchaser of labor power is able to extract from it. The surplus labor of the worker over and above the labor time necessary to replace the value represented by his wages is the source of surplus value, the source of the ceaselessly growing accumulation of capital. This unpaid labor of the worker is distributed amongst all the non-laboring members of society, and the whole social system in which we live is based on it. In itself, unpaid labor is certainly not an exclusive characteristic of modern bourgeois society. As long as possessing and dispossessed classes have existed, the latter have always had to perform unpaid labor. As long as one section of society possesses a monopoly of the means of production, then the worker, whether free or unfree, will have to work longer than the time necessary to maintain his own existence in order to provide foodstuffs, etc., for the owners of the means of production. Wage labor is only a particular historical form of the system of unpaid labor, which has existed since the division of society into classes, and it must be examined as such if it is to be understood correctly. In order to be able to transform his money into capital, the moneyed man must find free workers on the market. Free in the double sense that first of all they are free to dispose of their own labor power as a commodity, and free in the sense that they have no other commodities to dispose of, that they possess none of the means necessary to apply their labor power independently. This relation has no basis in the laws of nature, for nature does not produce on the one hand the owners of commodities, of money, and on the other hand those who own nothing but their labor power. It is further not a social relation common to all periods of history, but the result of a long period of historical development, the product of many economic changes and of the decline and disappearance of a whole series of earlier forms of social production. Commodity production is the starting point of capital. Commodity production, commodity circulation and developed commodity circulation, trade, form the historical conditions under which capital develops. The history of modern capital dates from the creation of modern world trade and of the modern world market in the 16th century. The delusion of the popular economists that once upon a time there was an elite of industrious men who accumulated riches, and a mass of lazy good-for-nothings who finally had nothing left to sell but their own skins, is stuff and nonsense, and the semi-enlightened fashion in which bourgeois historians describe the dissolution of the feudal mode of production as the emancipation of the worker, but not at the same time as the development of the feudal into the capitalist mode of production, is no better. The worker ceased to belong to the category of the means of production as did the slave and the serf. But he also ceased to possess the means of production like the peasant or artisan working on his own account. The great mass of the people was deprived of land, food and the means of production by a series of violent and brutal measures, which Marx describes in detail on the basis of English history in the chapter on primary accumulation. In this way the free worker needed by the capitalist mode of production was created. Capital came into the world oozing mud and blood from every pore, and as soon as it was able to stand on its own feet it not only maintained the separation of the worker from the means necessary to apply his labor power, but it reproduced this separation on an ever-increasing scale. Wage labor differs from earlier forms of unpaid labor as a result of the fact that the movement of capital is boundless and its voracious appetite for surplus labor insatiable. In societies in which the use value of a commodity is more important than its exchange value, surplus labor is limited to a more or less wide circle of needs. But the nature of this form of production does not result in an unlimited demand for surplus labor. Where the exchange value of a commodity is more important than its use value, the situation is different. As a producer with alien labor power, as an extractor of surplus labor and exploiter of labor power, capital, in point of energy, recklessness and effectiveness outdoes all previous modes of production based on direct forced labor. The main thing for capital is not the labor process, not the production of use values, but the process of utilization. The production of exchange values from which it can extract a greater value than it put in. The demand for surplus value knows no satiety. The production of exchange values knows no such limits as are drawn for the production of use values by the satisfaction of immediate needs. Just as a commodity is a combination of use and exchange values, so the process of commodity production is a combination of the labor process and the value-creating process. The value-creating process lasts up to the point where the value of labor power paid in wages is replaced by an equal amount of value. And beyond this point it develops into the process of producing surplus value, the process of utilization. As a combination of the labor process and the process of utilization it becomes the process of capitalist production, the capitalist form of commodity production. In the labor process labor power and the means of production work together. In the process of utilization the same capital components appear as constant and variable capital. Constant capital is transformed in the process of production into means of production, raw materials, auxiliary materials and tools of production, and does not change its value. Variable capital is transformed in the process of production into labor power and its value changes. It reproduces its own value and then produces a surplus over and above that value, a surplus value which may vary in volume and be larger or smaller according to circumstances. Marx thus clears the way for an examination of surplus value, which appears in two forms, relative and absolute surplus value. These have played a different, but each decisive role in the history of the capitalist mode of production. Absolute surplus value is produced when the capitalist causes the worker to work beyond the time necessary for the reproduction of his labor power. If the capitalist had his way, the working day would comprise 24 hours, for the longer the working day the more surplus value it produces. On the other hand, the worker has the justifiable feeling that every hour of labor time which he is compelled to perform over and above that necessary to reproduce his wages is unfairly extracted from him and that he has to pay with his own health for excessive labor time. The struggle between capitalist and worker concerning the length of the working day began with the first historical appearance of free workers on the market, and it has lasted down to the present day. The capitalist fights for profit, and, whether he is personally a good fellow or a blackguard, the competition of his fellow capitalists compels him to do everything possible to extend the working day to the limits of human endurance. The worker, on the other hand, fights to maintain his health and to secure a few free hours a day in which he can engage in other human activities apart from working, eating and sleeping. Marx describes powerfully the 50 years of civil war between the working class and the capitalist class in England, from the birth of large-scale industry, which drove the capitalists to break down every limit placed on the exploitation of the proletariat by nature and custom, age and sex, and day and night, up to the passing of the 10-hour bill, won by the working class in the struggle against capital as a powerful social obstacle preventing the workers selling themselves and their kind into death and slavery by free contract with capital. Relative surplus value is produced when the labor time necessary for the reproduction of labor power is reduced to the benefit of surplus labor. The value of labor power is reduced by an increase in the productivity of labor power in those industries whose products determine the value of labor power, and to this end a constant revolutionization of the mode of production, of the technical and social conditions of the labor process is necessary. The historical, economic, technological and socio-psychological observations which Marx then makes in a series of chapters dealing with cooperation, the division of labor and manufacture, and machinery and large-scale industry have been recognized, even by the representatives of the bourgeoisie, as a rich mine of scientific facts. Marx not only shows that machinery and large-scale industry have created greater misery than any previous mode of production known to history, but also that in their ceaseless revolutionization of capitalist society they are preparing the way for a higher social form. Factory legislation was the first conscious and methodical reaction of society to the unnatural form of its own process of production. When society regulates labor in factories and workshops, it appears for the moment only as an interference with the exploiting rights of capital. Nevertheless, the force of circumstances soon compels society to regulate household labor also and to interfere with parental authority. Acknowledging that large-scale industry liquidates the old family relations together with the economic basis of the old family system and the family labor which corresponded to it. However terrible and revolting the dissolution of the old family system within the capitalist system may appear, nevertheless, by granting a decisive role in the social process of production to women, young people and children beyond the sphere of the household, large-scale industry creates a new economic basis for a higher form of the family and for the relation of the sexes. Naturally, it is just as stupid to regard the Christian Germanic form of the family as absolute, as it would have been to regard the classical Roman form, or the classical Greek form, or the Oriental form as absolute, forms which, by the way, represent together a historical series of development. It is equally clear that the combined labor personnel, composed out of individuals of both sexes and various ages, must, under suitable conditions, change into a source of humane progress. Although in its untrammeled and brutal capitalist form it is the foul source of corruption and slavery. The machine which degrades the worker to its mere appendage creates at the same time the possibility of increasing the productive forces of society to such an extent that all members of society without exception could enjoy the same possibilities of a development worthy of human beings, a consummation for which all former societies were too poor. After examining the production of absolute and relative surplus value, Marx then proceeds to develop the first rational theory of wages known to the history of political economy. The price of a commodity is its value expressed in money, and wages represent the price of labor power. Not labor itself, but the living worker who offers his labor power for sale, appears in the commodity market, and labor arises only from the consumption of the commodity labor power. Labor is the substance and the immanent measure of values, but it has no value itself. However, labor appears to be paid for in wages because the worker receives his wages only after he has performed his labor. The form in which wages are paid effectively conceals every trace of the division of the working day into paid and unpaid labor time. With slaves it is exactly the opposite. The slave appears to be working for his master all the time even when he is working to reproduce the value of his own foodstuffs, and all his labor appears to be unpaid labor. With wage labor, however, all the labor, including even the unpaid labor, seems to be paid. In the one case the property relation conceals the fact that the slave is working part of the time for himself, whilst in the other case the money relation conceals the fact that the wage worker is working part of the time for nothing. We realize therefore, points out Marx, the decisive importance of the transformation of the value and price of labor power into the form of wages, or into the value and price of labor itself. All the legal conceptions of both the capitalists and the workers, all the mystifications of the capitalist mode of production, all its illusions of freedom and all the extenuating humbug of popular political economy are based on this appearance, which conceals the real state of affairs and suggests exactly the contrary. The two chief forms of wages are time wages and peace wages. On the basis of the laws governing time wages, Marx demonstrates the emptiness of the contentions that the shortening of the working day must lower wages, as put forward by people with an axe to grind, and shows that exactly the contrary is true. A temporary shortening of the working day lowers wages, but a permanent shortening raises wages. The longer the working day, the lower the wage. Peace wages are nothing but a changed form of time wages, and they are the form of wages best suited to the capitalist mode of production. This form of wages spread widely during the actual manufacturing period, and in the storm and stress period of English large-scale industry it served as a lever to lengthen the working day and lower wages. Peace wages are very advantageous for the capitalist because they render supervision of the workers almost unnecessary and at the same time offer many opportunities for making deductions from wages, and practicing other forms of cheating. On the other hand, this form of wages possesses many big disadvantages for the worker. Physical exhaustion as the result of excessive efforts to raise the level of wages, efforts which in fact tend rather to lower wages. Increased competition amongst the workers with the resultant weakening of their solidarity. The appearance of parasitic elements between the capitalists and the workers, of middlemen who pocket a substantial part of the workers' wages, and similar disagreeable phenomena. The relation of surplus value and wages causes the capitalist mode of production to reproduce constantly not only the capital of the capitalist, but also the poverty of the worker. On the one hand there is the capitalist class owning all the foodstuffs, all the raw materials and all the means of production, and on the other hand there is the working class, the great mass of human beings, who are compelled to sell their labor power to the capitalists in return for that quantity of food which in the best case is sufficient to maintain them in working condition and permit the production of a new generation of working proletarians. But capital does not merely reproduce itself, it increases its volume constantly, and Marx devotes the final part of his first volume to examining this process of accumulation. Not only does surplus value result from capital, but capital results from surplus value. A part of the annually produced surplus value which is distributed amongst the possessing classes is consumed by them as income, but another part is accumulated as capital. The unpaid labor which has been extracted from the workers now serves as a means to extract still further unpaid labor from them. In the stream of production all the originally advanced capital becomes a vanishing quantity compared with the directly accumulated capital, that is, with that surplus value or surplus product which is changed back into capital, whether it is still functioning in the hands of him who originally accumulated it or in the hands of another. The law of private property, based on commodity production and commodity circulation, transforms itself into its direct opposite thanks to its own internal and inevitable dialectic. The laws of commodity production seem to justify a property right in individual labor. Commodity owners with equal rights face each other. The means to obtain the other commodity is only the sale of one's own commodity, and one's own commodity can be produced only by labor. Property, on the side of the capitalist, now appears as the right to appropriate the unpaid labor of others or its produce, and on the side of the worker as the impossibility of appropriating his own product. When the modern proletariat began to grasp the meaning of this, when the urban proletariat in Lyons sounded the tocsin and the rural proletariat in England laid fire to the houses of their oppressors, the popular political economists invented the abstinence theory, according to which capital was accumulated by the voluntary abstinence of the capitalists. A theory which Marx scourged as mercilessly as Lassalle had done before him. An instance of abstinence really contributing to the accumulation of capital is the compulsory abstinence of the workers, the brutal depression of wages below the value of labor power in order to turn the necessary consumption funds of the workers into the accumulation funds of the capitalists, at least in part. This is the real origin of all the lamentations about the luxurious life of the workers, the endless jeremiad about the grand pianos which some workers are alleged to have purchased at some time or other, all the cheap and nasty concoctions of the Christian social reformers, and all the other related tricks and frauds used by the intellectual hod carriers of capitalism. The general law of capitalist accumulation is as follows: the growth of capital includes the growth of its variable section, or that part which is changed into labor power. If the composition of capital remains unchanged, if a certain quantity of the means of production demands always the same quantity of labor power to set it into motion, then obviously the demand for labor power will grow in proportion with the growth of capital, as will also the subsistence funds of the workers. The quicker capital grows, the quicker they must grow also. As simple reproduction constantly reproduces the capital relation itself, so accumulation reproduces the capital relation on a larger scale. More capitalists or bigger capitalists on the one hand, and more wage workers on the other, The accumulation of capital is therefore the increase of the proletariat also, and in the case supposed this increase takes place under the most favorable conditions for the workers, a larger part of their own increasing surplus product, which increasingly changes into capital, returns to them in the form of means of payment so that they are able to increase their consumption and to equip themselves more generously with clothing, furniture, etc. However, their relation of dependency towards the capitalist does not change in any way, just as a slave does not cease to be a slave if he is well fed and well clothed. They must always provide a certain quantity of unpaid labor, and although this may diminish, it can never do so to an extent seriously endangering the capitalist character of the process of production. If wages rise above this point, then the profit incentive is blunted and the accumulation of capital slackens until wages sink again to a level corresponding to the needs of its utilization. However, only when the accumulation of capital takes place without any change in the relation between its constant and variable components can the golden chain which the wage worker himself forges grow, lighter and less irksome. In reality, the process of accumulation is accompanied by a great revolution in what Marx calls the organic composition of capital. Constant capital grows at